maybe just a little further back. I guess I can move back. Okay. Tonight we're going to look at the subject of the beast in the book of Revelation. One of the problems with doing that, I almost feel like I'm falling into a trap or falling into a practice that I despise in other people when they do it, and that is that the book of Revelation, as I said the first night, is the revelation of Jesus Christ. I'm just kicking things around here. Don't mind me. Thanks. The revelation of Jesus Christ. And in our perverse age, our Bible expositors turn the revelation of Jesus Christ into the revelation of the Antichrist. People come to Revelation studies not to hear about Jesus, but to hear about the beast, to hear about a whore, to hear about who's burning up at the last judgment, to find out how many judgments there are, to find out everything but about Jesus Christ. And so I want to stress at the outset that my concern in talking about the beast is not just to give you a bunch of fun stuff about the beast. It's still to communicate Jesus Christ to you. And I hope that by the end of the night I will have done that real clearly. And what you're going to walk out of here remembering is not so much the gory stuff that I tell you about the beast, but what I tell you about Jesus Christ. I have to admit that I did win a prize once at a summer camp for being the goriest storyteller they ever heard. I still have that award hanging on my door. Well, the beast shows up primarily in the book of Revelation in chapter 13. Tell you what, let's just read part of it, and then we'll get amazing. I'm actually starting out a study in the book of Revelation, But don't hold your breath. Revelation 13, John says, I stood on the sand of the sea, and I saw a beast rising up out of the sea, having 7 heads and 10 horns, and on his horns 10 crowns, and on his heads a blasphemous name. Now the beast which I saw was like a leopard, his feet were like the feet of a bear, and his mouth like the mouth of a lion. And the dragon gave him his power, his throne, and great authority. I saw one of his heads as if it had been mortally wounded, and his deadly wound was healed, and all the world marveled and followed the beast. Actually, let me back up. That word world there in the translation I'm reading is not there in the Greek. It reads earth or land. Okay, so the whole land marveled and followed the beast. So they worshiped the dragon who gave authority to the beast, and they worshiped the beast, saying, Who is like the beast? Who is able to make war with him? And he was given a mouth speaking great things and blasphemies, and he was given authority to continue for 42 months. Then he opened his mouth in blasphemy against God, to blaspheme his name, his tabernacle, those who dwell in heaven, those who tabernacle in heaven. And it was granted him to make war with the saints and to overcome them. And authority was given him over every tribe, tongue, and nation. And all who dwell on the earth or the land will worship him, whose names have not been written in the book of life of the Lamb slain from the foundation of the world. If anyone has an ear, let him hear. He who leads into captivity shall go into captivity. He who kills with the sword must be killed with the sword. Here is the perseverance and the faith of the saints. Now, there are and have been a lot of theories as to who this beast is. We have to remember fundamental principles. We don't just go straight to the book of Revelation chapter 13 to find out who the beast is. We have to go to, for one thing, Revelation chapter 1, verse 1. Okay? Revelation chapter 1, verse 1, written to these early Christians in the first century, the revelation of Jesus Christ, which God gave him to show his servants things which must shortly take place. Verse 3, last line, the time is near. And again throughout Revelation, John says the same thing. These things are shortly going to come to pass. The time is near. This is a contemporary prophecy, meaning contemporary to them. The beast, well, in fact, before we get into the meaning of this, look at chapter 13, verse 18. John says, "Here is wisdom. Let him who has understanding calculate the number of the beast, for it is the number of a man. His number is 666. Now, as I said before, if that number of the beast, 666, adds up to Henry Kissinger or Adolf Hitler or Ayatollah Khomeini or whoever, anybody in the 20th century, then something's desperately wrong with what John said there. Because John, writing to first century Christians, dangles in front of them the possibility that they can interpret this. How could they possibly have interpreted it if the meaning is something limited to the 20th century? If it means something to the 20th century and would be utter nonsense to the first century, then I say Revelation 13 verse 18 lies. Because it tells first century Christians to whom this book was written. Let me just prove that. Revelation chapter 1, surprise, surprise, verse 4. I mean, we've exegeted the first 3 verses, okay? Verse 4, John to the 7 churches which are in Asia. Okay? Not even to the 7 churches which will be in Asia someday, but the 7 churches which are, present tense, all you Greek students, are in Asia. Okay? So the churches which were in Asia at the precise moment that John wrote this, John says it's possible, not everybody, but those who have wisdom can find out what this means. So unless we're willing to say that John is dangling before them a possibility that is really impossible, that he's holding out some bait and it's really a fraud, we have to say that the fulfillment of this prophecy is in the first century. That first century Christians could know who the beast is, and therefore the beast was someone in the first century. So if up to this moment in your life you've been deathly afraid of the beast getting hold of you, cheer up, you missed him. Okay? Now, there still are bad guys in the world. So, sorry, but you still have to trust God, okay? You still do. There are bad guys in the world, but the beast was in the first century. So we have to begin with that. Now, actually, where we're going to begin is, can anybody guess? Genesis. Amazing. We begin with Adam. We're going to be in Genesis chapter 3, but, this is actually going to get us into Genesis chapter 1 eventually. So we're going all the way back. But, I'm going to be easy on you. We're going to go to Genesis 3 first. Well, speaking of Genesis 1, okay, Adam was created in the image of God. Okay? In the image of God. In other words, people were supposed to go walking past Adam, angels or something, okay, beasts. They go walking past Adam and look at him and say, whoa, I can't see God, because no one's ever seen God because he's invisible, but if I could see God, that's what he'd look like. That's what the image of God is. Adam was the image of God. He was a reflection. He looked like God. If God was clothed in human flesh, that's what he'd look like. That's what it means to be the image of God. Adam was the icon of God. He represented God. He wasn't God, but he was as much like God, or at least supposed to be as much like God, as was possible for a creature to be. Now, I want to make this clear because, unfortunately, there are some wackos running around who, whenever we start talking about the image of God, they get nervous. And they say, oh, you're saying that man can become God. Well, no. God is God. He is the only one there is. He's the only one there ever will be. But we're supposed to be like him, as much like him as it's possible for a creature to be. But there's always a creator-creature distinction. There will never be an exact likeness between God, the Creator, and us. Now, sometimes in the Bible, for purposes of emphasis, in both Old Testament and New Testament, people are called gods. Rulers are called gods. Judges are called gods. Why is that? It's because they, in a particular respect, image God. When we think of God, one thing we're supposed to think of is God the judge, seated on his throne, ruling over all creation. And for that reason, rulers and judges, those who hold office, are called gods in Scripture. Psalm 82, Jesus quotes that in John chapter 10. Both testaments call human beings gods, but that does not mean equal with God. Okay? Having said that, Genesis chapter 3, here comes the dragon, the serpent. The serpent was more cunning than any beast of the field which the Lord God had made, and he said to the woman, Has God indeed said, You shall not eat of every tree of the garden? And the woman said to the serpent, We may eat of the fruit of the trees of the garden, but of the fruit of the tree which is in the midst of the garden, God has said, You shall not eat it, nor shall you touch it, lest you die. Now she's probably expanding a little bit on what God said. And by the way, let me point out that in Genesis 1:29, God said to Adam and Eve, You may eat of every tree. Every tree. Genesis 1:29, you may eat of every tree. And then later in Genesis 2, God puts a restriction. And he says, don't eat of this one. Now what that tells me is that eventually they would have gotten to eat the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, but not yet. Now what does the knowledge of good and evil mean? If you get out of concordance and just look up the phrase, knowledge of good and evil, and just to find out, you might turn to places, write these down, we're not going to turn to them, but for instance, Deuteronomy 1:39, okay? Places like that, I can give you some more if you want later. The idea of the knowledge of good and evil means maturity, mature judgment, the ability to pass mature judgment. As you're raising children, actually we raise turnips, right? We rear children. As you're rearing them, training them up, your child gets old enough to walk, but not old enough to cross the street by himself. Why? Because he doesn't have judgment. Okay? His abilities are beyond his judgment. And you, as a conscientious parent, will not allow your child to cross the street until his judgment has caught up with his ability. The limit of what you can physically do is not the same as the limit of what you are ethically allowed to do. We can do all kinds of things, but we're not allowed to. And so God wanted Adam and Eve to mature in judgment. So he had two trees in the middle of the garden, and he said, I want you to eat of the fruit of the tree of life. And the foundation of our life and our relationship with him is grace. He just gives us this gift. He gave Adam and Eve a gift and said, I want you to eat of every tree, especially this one that I put in the middle of the garden. But there's another tree that you have to grow up into. And that tree of the knowledge of good and evil, in other words, the tree of judgment, the tree of the ability to pass accurate, responsible judgment, is a sacrament that Adam and Eve are allowed to get to once they have passed a test. And what God did was he allowed a tempter to come in, he allowed a test to come up against them, and Adam and Eve were supposed to pass the test. It seems to me, and I could go into this at length based on some other stuff, it's in a forthcoming book if the book ever comes forth. We're waiting and praying. That Adam and Eve, if they had passed the test, then they would have been granted that tree. In other words, if they had demonstrated responsible, mature judgment, the ability to discern between good and evil, then they would have been granted access to the tree. Instead, what they did wrong was what the tempter held out before them. He said, "You will not surely die, for God knows that in the day you eat of it, your eyes will be open, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil." Now there is a difference. There is a difference. How does God know good and evil? Does God have a Bible that somebody gave him that he looks it up in to find out what good and evil are? No. How do we know what good and evil are? God says so. That's why. The reason why some things are good and some things are evil is because God said this is good and that's evil. That's why. That's the only reason why. All morality is based on theology. That's God. God said this is good, this is evil. Adam and Eve made the sin, committed the sin of wanting to be like God, knowing good and evil, which is what? Saying for ourselves what's good and evil. God says for himself what's good and evil. Well, I want to be that way. I want to be like God, knowing good and evil. How does God know good and evil? He determines it. He just says, this is good, this is evil. So this was a desire to be autonomous, to be God's. Not the image of God, not content with being the image of God, but being God. Okay? Being equal with God. Not in his image, not his reflection. Not showing what he's like and being a pointer to him, but having glory all to myself and making up my own good and evil. That's sin. That's the original sin. Deciding for myself what good and evil are. That's what everybody's sin is, folks. Every single time you do something wrong, you're doing what they did. Making up your own rules. Saying, well, you know. And every time you do something wrong, even when you know it's wrong, even when you admit it's wrong, still there are mitigating circumstances. Well, I know this is wrong, but I have a good reason for it. Okay? You are trying to be as God, knowing good and evil. That's sin. Okay. So, here's Adam and Eve, and they are the image of God. They're to reflect God and be on earth as it is in heaven. Okay? There's God. Here's man. You can't see God, but you can see man. This is what he looks like. And they image him. But they image him by being in submission to him. And God said, wait. I want you to wait. I tell my children, I have this little catechism I go through with them. If you go up to one of my children later, any one of them, and say, or actually any of the kids in the church by this time, my church back home, what's the most important lesson God can ever have you to learn? And they always answer back, patience. Learn to wait. My daughter, this is a digression, but my daughter had these, my wife came home with these beautiful blue shoes. She gave them to my daughter. My daughter put them on. They were beautiful blue shoes, but they didn't fit. She wasn't quite big enough for them. And that was an important lesson for Abby to learn. That Abby had to face the fact that someone who loves me can give me a good gift. And that gift is wonderful, and I'm supposed to have that gift, but not yet. I'm supposed to wait. See? Now I hope when my daughter is 16 and has the ability to jump in a back seat with somebody, that she remembers that God has a very good and wonderful gift for her, and there's nothing wrong with that gift, and he wants her to have it, but not yet. Now she's not going to be able to wait then if she's not waiting for blue shoes now. See? Real important lesson. Don't grab for it yet. And man's basic problem throughout life has been grabbing for something now instead of waiting. Okay, so Adam and Eve were to submit to God, and their imaging of him was ethical, having to do with their submission to him. And as long as they worshipped him and served him, they imaged him. There's a basic biblical principle of sanctification. You become like what you worship. Okay? The Psalms say that. They laugh at all these false gods. They can't see, they can't hear, they can't speak, on and on and on. And then the punchline, Psalm 115 is one of them, punchline is, all those who worship them are like them. You become like what you worship. Adam and Eve were like God. That was great. And then the dragon came and he said, I've got another plan. I've got another way. You don't have to wait. Grab it now. Be autonomous. Make up your own rules. And in seeking to be free, they became slaves of the dragon, slaves of the serpent, and they submitted to him. And guess what? The image is gone. Not completely. Man is always the image of God, but it's twisted and marred and disfigured and broken. And man now begins to look like the dragon, committing the sin of the dragon, trying to be like God in a way you're not supposed to be. So man fell. God had said, in the day that you eat the fruit of that tree, you will die. You will die if you eat of that. And so Adam and Eve suddenly realized that they had lost the glory of God. They're standing there naked. And then they hear, oh, and this is so weird. People, they heard the sound of the Lord God walking in the garden in the cool of the day, Tiny Tim tripping through the tulips, you know? That's what people think. Swish, swish, here comes God walking through. It's not at all. It says they heard the sound, the voice of the Lord God walking in the garden, traversing the garden as the Spirit of the day. That's what it literally says in the Hebrew. I don't have time to tell you everything that means, but I'll tell you one thing it means, okay? Psalm 29. When it says, this is just for free, this isn't planned. How are we going to get to Revelation? But this is really good stuff. We need to get the picture of what's going on here. That word voice, they heard the voice or the sound of the Lord God coming through the garden, is a technical word that has to do with the cloud. Have I talked about the cloud before? Okay, I've talked about the cloud, okay? I mean, God's Spirit, right? The glory cloud and all that stuff, full of angels, and it makes all this noise, okay? And it sounds like angels blowing trumpets, and it sounds like lightning and thunder. It sounds like a rushing mighty wind. It sounds like waterfalls. It sounds like army marching. It sounds like chariots rumbling, horses' hooves pounding. I mean, it's really a big noise. And every time, it's the Hebrew word kol. Okay, you can write it K-O-L, kol. And it's this voice, this big sound that the cloud makes. Okay? Ha! Blew those speakers out. Okay. It's this distinctive sound. Now, if you want to see what that sound is like, look at Psalm 29, starting verse 3. 7 times the voice, the sound is mentioned. The voice of the Lord is over the waters. Verse 3, the God of glory thunders. The Lord is over many waters. The voice of the Lord is powerful. The voice of the Lord is full of majesty. The voice of the Lord breaks the cedars. Okay, wham, they all go falling down. What's the EPA going to say about this? Yes, the Lord splinters the cedars of Lebanon. He makes them also skip like a calf, Lebanon and Syrian like a young wild ox. The voice of the Lord divides the flames of fire, shoots lightning out. The voice of the Lord shakes the wilderness. The Lord shakes the wilderness of Kadesh. You know what that's a reference to? When those people disobeyed God, remember, in the wilderness? And the voice came out from the cloud, and boom, the earth opened up. And they got swallowed up alive right into hell. Okay? That's the voice. The voice of the Lord, verse 9, makes the deer give birth. Okay? All these cattle are out there. They're just, in the beginning of pregnancy, and then suddenly, wah, I mean, help me. Okay? And they give birth all over the place. And strips the forest bare. And in his temple, everyone says, glory. Okay? That's the voice of the Lord. Okay, Adam and Eve have just sinned. They've just disobeyed God. And you know what it's like. Your hand's in the cookie jar, you're on top of a couple chairs, and Mama comes in the kitchen, right? And it's too late to run. This is worse. I mean, they're standing there in the Garden of Eden, and suddenly all the deer start having babies. The trees all fall down. Boom, 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 and here he comes. Oh, what am I going to do? Okay? This is what they heard. They heard the voice. Okay. Now God comes in judgment. And God had said, when you eat of the fruit of that tree, you will die. They were under the death penalty right then. And what God could have done right then is to kill them. That ends them. That ends you and me. And God could have gone off and created another world somewhere and started all over. Now, God did want to start all over, but He didn't want to destroy the work that He'd made. Because in the very beginning, He looked at everything He'd made and said, "It is very good. I want this." And He wasn't going to let some puny little rodent like the devil come in and mess it up for Him. So what's He going to do? He doesn't go make new things. He makes all things new. That is salvation. So He comes to Adam and Eve, and in grace, He says, okay, you're not going to die, but blood is demanded for this, and an animal is slain. Down to verse 21 of Genesis 3. Also for Adam and his wife, the Lord God made tunics of skin and clothed them. That's really pregnant right there. What does that mean? He made tunics of skin. He didn't just go, poof, there are tunics of skin. Animal skins. An animal had to die. And Adam and Eve saw before them, graphically pictured their own death. God takes a lamb or a goat and He kills it, and they realize, boy, that's me. That should be me right there. And right then they realize substitutionary atonement. They didn't realize everything there was to realize about it, but they did realize that. So God clothed them with skins, and that was gracious. Their covering didn't work. God provided a covering for them, an atonement for them. A covering for their sins, a covering for their nakedness. God promised them a Redeemer that would come from their seed. But I want you to notice something. This grace also had judgment connected with it. Because when God clothed them, He clothed them with the skins of a beast. And even in redemption, Adam and Eve looked like beasts. They didn't look like God anymore. They didn't have the glory of God. Man has sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. They fell short of the glory of God. And even in redemption, the clothing that they had to wear made them look like beasts, made them look like animals. There was something else. God said to Adam in verse 17, "Because you have heeded the voice of your wife and have eaten from the tree of which I commanded you, saying, you shall not eat of it, cursed is the ground for your sake. In toil you shall eat of it all the days of your life. Both thorns and thistles it shall bring forth for you, and you shall eat the herb of the field. In the sweat of your face you shall eat bread, till you return to the ground, for out of it you were taken, for dust you are, and to dust you shall return." And so Adam is clothed with a skin, and he looks like a beast, and he gets a mark on his forehead. Right? A mark of his submission to the dragon. He looks like a beast, and he's got sweat on his brow. And that begins a pattern in the Bible of something on the forehead. Now, originally, Adam had glory shining from him. Now he's still glowing, okay? But it's a different kind of glory. He's got sweat on his brow. God wanted to tell His people, though, it's not always going to be like that. And I am going to provide a Redeemer. The seed of the woman is going to come, and He's going to crush the head of the serpent. And God provided pictures of redemption throughout the Old Covenant period to show His people what His salvation, His full salvation, was going to bring. And so when God set up the high priest was an image of man fully restored to God. So he was clothed in these glorious robes. And as Aaron walked along, he had all these shining, fiery colors coming at him. Reds and greens and blues and golds. And he just looked like, as one commentator said, fiery light. And on his head, to cover up the sweat of his brow, to cover up the mark of the beast, he had gold. And gold in Scripture again and again speaks of the glory of God. It's beautiful. Gold is pretty. We're supposed to think it's pretty. God thinks it's pretty. That's why He made it. And Aaron had a gold plate on his forehead, covering his forehead, that said, "Holiness to the Lord." Holiness to the Lord. And the promise is that someday everything, down to the bells on the horses, Zechariah says, everything in all of God's creation is going to have on it holiness to the Lord. But it starts out here. God gives this image, this picture of redemption. Man fully restored. You can't see the sweat anymore. because it's covered up with the glory of God. Moses was another picture of this. In Exodus 34, Moses goes to see God. I'm not going to be turning to Exodus 34. I'll tell you where I will turn. Deuteronomy 6, okay? Exodus 34, Moses goes to see God, and Moses is a picture of man fully restored to God. Moses the prophet, Aaron the priest. And Moses goes to speak to God face to face. And meeting with God face to face, he looks at God and reflects His glory. As he looks into the face of God, he receives the glory of God. And so he comes down and has to put a veil over his face because he's shining so brightly, people can't handle it. And God is saying, someday that's going to be true of all of you. That I am going to restore you through intimate communion with me. You are again going to reflect my glory. I'm not going to let Satan drag this creation down into death and destruction. I am going to redeem my creation, and I'm going to again fill you with the glory of God, and fill the whole earth with the glory of God. Deuteronomy chapter 6, beginning at verse 4. Hear, O Israel, Shema Israel. The Lord our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your might. By the way, next time you hear some turnip brain talking to you about love is in the New Testament and there's other stuff in the Old Testament, Deuteronomy 6, verse 5, okay? It's right there. Verse 6, and these words which I command you today shall be in your heart. You shall teach them diligently to your children, and shall talk of them when you sit in your house, when you walk by the way, when you lie down, when you rise up. You shall bind them as a sign on your hand, and they shall be as frontlets between your eyes. You shall write them on the doorposts of your house and on your gates. God says, I want you to take my law and bind it on your hand so that no action of your hand can take place except according to my law. And I want you to put my law on your forehead so that every thought of your mind is according to my law. And then I want you to take my law and put it over your doorposts so that your whole household, your family life is according to my law. And then I want you to take my law and put it on your gates so that your civic life, your social life, your political life is all based on my law. Okay? So this becomes a symbol of dedication, consecration to God, wholehearted obedience to His commandments. You have a sign. The individual has a sign on his hand and a sign on his head. And God did not mean you really tie the book of Deuteronomy to your hand and really slap it up on your forehead. Okay? He meant live this way. Live as if you've got Deuteronomy. One of my nephews, somebody asked him what he got, what kind of a shot he got at the doctor's. And he said, well, I think I got a shot of, what was it? He named different... I got a shot of this, and I got a shot of that, and I got a Deuteronomy shot. I think he meant DPT or something, but what we need is a good shot of Deuteronomy, okay? Well, if we obey God's law, and if we have God's sign bound on our hand and bound to our forehead, that means something real practical. God got real mad at His disobedient, adulterous people. And in Ezekiel chapter 9, Ezekiel says, Then God called out in my hearing with a loud voice, saying, Let those who have charge over the city draw near, each with a deadly weapon in his hand. And suddenly 6 men came from the direction of the upper gate, which faces north, each with his battle axe in his hand. One man among them was clothed with linen and had a writer's inkhorn at his side. They went in and stood beside the bronze altar. So there are 6 men with battle axes and 1 man with a pen. Now, verse 3, Now the glory of the God of Israel had gone up from the cherub where it had been to the threshold of the temple. And he called to the man clothed with linen who had the writer's inkhorn at his side. And the Lord said to him, Go through the midst of the city and through the midst of Jerusalem and put a mark. By the way, in Hebrew, that's the letter Tav, which back in those days looked like a cross. And the early Christians said, Wow, isn't that neat? Anyway, put a mark on the foreheads of the men who sigh and cry over all the abominations that are done within it. To the others he said in my hearing, Go after him through the city and kill. Do not let your eyes spare, nor have any pity. Utterly slay old and young men, maidens and little children and women, but do not come near anyone on whom is the mark, and begin at my sanctuary. So they began with the elders who were before the temple. I like that. Elders, take note, perk those ears up. I better have the mark. Okay? So the mark, see, understand, the history of this mark is God's people have a mark and the bad guys have a mark. Everybody's got a mark. Who do you serve? Whom do you serve, I should say. Whom do you serve, okay? Who is your God? Whom do you obey? Whose law is on your hand? What do you do with your hands? What do you do with your mind? Whose law is there? God knows who's got the mark. And He sends out destroyers to destroy those who don't have His mark. But everybody's got a mark. That's the background of this kind of imagery in the book of Revelation. Now, one more thing. Let me tell you this. This is so fun. Ezekiel chapter 44. I think we're going to get to Revelation. Ezekiel 44, verse 17. The context of this, starting up at verse 15, is talking about, well, actually starting before that, really the whole section here has to do with laws about the priests. And so God is giving laws about the priests. Now, this is based on Exodus chapter 28, verse 5, and verses 42 to 43, where it says that the priests were required to dress in linen. Why linen? And that they were not allowed, while on duty, to wear wool. Now, when a priest got off duty, he could go home and put on all the wool he wanted to, but he was not allowed to be clothed with wool or with anything like that. While he was on duty, it could only be linen. In other words, be clothed with vegetables, not animals. Okay? Why is that? Verse 17 of Ezekiel 44, it shall be whenever they enter the gates of the inner court that they shall put on linen garments. No wool shall come upon them while they minister within the gates of the inner court or within the house. They shall have linen turbans on their heads and linen trousers on their bodies. They shall not clothe themselves with anything that causes sweat. Why? Because sweat is an image of man's subservience to the dragon. Now, let me put in a little point here, just in case anybody goes running off with this in wrong directions. This does not mean that somebody is honestly working hard at his trade and works up a sweat, that there's something sinful about him. Okay? That's a condition that we're all under. Everybody sweats. Okay? Even Jesus did. Okay? Everybody sweats. The issue is not sweat. The issue is this imagery, this symbolism. The condition of sweat is a condition that humankind has been placed under ever since Adam's fall. Like the old couplet goes, in Adam's fall we sinned all. And that judgment has come upon the whole human race. There's no escaping that. But the priests were supposed to be an image, a picture of what man would be like when he's fully restored. Not every man can be like this, but when the priests are on duty in the tabernacle or the temple, they were not allowed to wear anything that showed sweat. So they wore linen garments, no wool, okay, no animal skins like Adam and Eve. They couldn't look like beasts. They wore vegetables. They wore linen. And they wore gold over here saying holiness to the Lord. You couldn't see sweat. You couldn't see sweat. Maybe it got cold and they shivered a little bit, but they didn't sweat. Okay, Revelation chapter 3. He who overcomes, Jesus says, shall be clothed in white garments. What's he talking about? Linen, priestly garments. And I will not blot out his name from the book of life, but I will confess his name before my Father and before his angels. Look down to verse 11. Behold, I come quickly. Hold fast what you have, that no one may take your crown. What crown is that? It's that gold band, holiness to the Lord. We've all got it. Okay? God doesn't see the sweat on our brow. He sees holiness to the Lord. Verse 12, he who overcomes, I will make him a pillar in the temple of my God, and he shall go out no more, and I will write on him the name of my God, and the name of the city of my God, the new Jerusalem, which comes down out of heaven from my God, and I will write on him my new name. Your brow has on it holiness to the Lord. You have God's very name on you. Revelation chapter 7, same kind of thing that we see in Ezekiel chapter 9. Revelation 7, verse 1, by the way, angels run the weather, folks. Angels run the weather. After these things I saw 4 angels standing at the 4 corners of the earth, holding the 4 winds of the earth, that the wind should not blow on the earth, on the sea, or on any tree. Then I saw another angel ascending from the east, having the seal of the living God. And he cried with a loud voice to the 4 angels to whom it was granted to harm the earth and the sea, saying, do not harm the earth, the sea, or the trees, till we have sealed the servants of our God on their foreheads. Same idea. This is not supposed to be a mystery to you anymore. Okay, if you understand Deuteronomy chapter 6, that the law of God is on our hands, the law of God is on our foreheads, click, 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 it all makes sense. Whatever God it is you're serving, you've got His mark. And that is His mark of ownership and protection. So God protects you, and the devil protects you. Ha, ha, ha. Okay? Revelation 14, verse 1, same basic thing. I looked, and behold, the Lamb standing on Mount Zion, and with Him 144,000, having His Father's name written on their foreheads. And then finally, Revelation 22, verse 4. They shall see His face like Moses and glow with the glory of God. And His name shall be on their foreheads like Aaron. We got Moses, we got Aaron. They shall see His face, and His name shall be on their foreheads. Okay, understanding that, let's go to Daniel. Now we're going to change gears. Daniel chapter 2, I don't have time to go into all the stuff here, but it would be a lot of fun, but I'm not going to do it. Just this point, King Nebuchadnezzar, this pagan king of Babylon, has a dream. And in this dream he sees this image, and the head is of gold, the next part is silver, then below that is bronze, chest and arms of silver, belly and thighs of bronze, legs of iron, feet partly of iron, partly of clay. And so Daniel interprets the vision for him, the dream. And he says, get this, verse 37, this is real important. Daniel 2:37, look at the language that is used about Nebuchadnezzar. You, O king, are a king of kings. Where have you heard that before? For the God of heaven has given you a kingdom, power, strength, and glory. And wherever the children of men dwell, or the beasts of the field and the birds of the heaven, He has given them into your hand and has made you ruler over them all. You are this head of gold. You know what Nebuchadnezzar was? He was like Adam. God had ordained him, created him, set him up as King of kings and Lord of lords. And he ruled over, he had dominion over the whole earth. He was the emperor of the world. He was another Adam. There were a lot of second Adams. None of them worked. Okay? That's why actually, the Bible doesn't actually call Christ the second Adam. It calls him the last Adam. Okay? There are a bunch of them in between. He was the second man, second beginner of the human race, as we'll see. But here's Nebuchadnezzar like another Adam. And he's ruler over the world, has dominion over the whole world. And then look what happened. Chapter 3, verse 1, Nebuchadnezzar the king made an image of gold, whose height was 60 cubits and its width 6 cubits. And he told everybody to worship it. We'll go on to somewhere else. Chapter 4, verse 28. All this came upon King Nebuchadnezzar. At the end of the 12 months he was walking about the royal palace of Babylon. The king spoke, saying, I'm God! Okay? The same sin Adam committed. Here he is. He's been made King of kings and Lord of lords, and he's ruler over the whole earth. Everything is under his dominion. And suddenly he begins to think it's his. Okay? Is not this great Babylon that I have built for a royal dwelling by my mighty power and for the honor of my majesty? And while the word was still in the king's mouth, a voice fell from heaven, King Nebuchadnezzar, to you, no, maybe a voice fell from heaven, okay? King Nebuchadnezzar, to you it is spoken, the kingdom has departed from you, okay? Adam, you're out of the garden. And like Adam, he became a beast. They shall drive you from men, and your dwelling shall be with the beasts of the field. They shall make you eat grass like oxen, and 7 times shall pass over you, until you know that the Most High rules in the kingdom of men, and gives it to whomever He chooses. That very hour the word was fulfilled concerning Nebuchadnezzar. He was driven from man, and ate grass like oxen. His body was wet with the dew of heaven, till his hair had grown like eagle's feathers, and his nails like bird's claws. Nebuchadnezzar became a werewolf. Okay, Nebuchadnezzar became a beast. Here's the King of Kings, and he falls to the level of being a beast. As King of Kings, I mean, we know who the real King of Kings is. It's God. There's only one real King of Kings, but God himself calls Nebuchadnezzar the King of Kings. Why? Because Nebuchadnezzar imaged him. And as long as Nebuchadnezzar would obey him and submit to him and recognize that God is God, then he could continue to be King of Kings. He could continue to image him. And then he says, no, I'm God. He thinks it's for the might of his own glory and honor and power and strength and wisdom and all that stuff. And as soon as he says that, he's cut off at the knees. He's turned into a beast. Now that becomes an important image. Daniel chapter 7. Because we should understand by now that a beast is someone who has been given dominion and power and glory. He rules over others and is supposed to image God and instead turns against God and tries to rule on his own terms, tries to know good and evil like God knows good and evil, tries to make up his own right and wrong. So a beast is a man in the image of God who has tried to become his own God and tries to rule on his own terms and according to his own laws. That happened to Adam, happened to a lot of other people, happened to Nebuchadnezzar in the book of Daniel. And now in Daniel chapter 4, Daniel tells us his vision. Chapter 7, verse 1. Daniel spoke, saying, I saw in my vision by night, and behold, the four winds of heaven were stirring up the great sea, and four great beasts came up from the sea, each different from the others. And so you should by now, without anybody's help, be able to say, oh, rebel emperors, okay? We know what beasts are. A beast is an emperor who has become a rebel. The first was like a lion and had eagle's wings. I watched till its wings were plucked off. It was lifted up from the earth and made to stand on 2 feet like a man, and a man's heart was given to it, because that's Nebuchadnezzar, because Nebuchadnezzar repented, and he recognized God for who God is, if you read the rest of Daniel chapter 4, and instead of being a beast, he was turned back into a man. Okay? That's an important redemptive truth. Beasts can turn into men. Men can turn into beasts. Beasts can turn into men. Nebuchadnezzar turned back into a man. Verse 5, Suddenly, Medo-Persia, another beast, a second like a bear. It was raised up on one side and had 3 ribs in its mouth between its teeth. And they said thus to it, Arise, devour much flesh. After this I looked, and there was another like a leopard, which had on its back 4 wings of a bird. The beast also had 4 heads, and dominion was given to it. That's important. Verse 7. So we had Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece, and now Rome. After this I saw in the night visions, and behold, a 4th beast, dreadful and terrible, exceedingly strong, and had huge iron teeth. It was devouring, breaking in pieces, and trampling the residue with its feet. It was different from all the beasts that were before it, and it had 10 horns. Now if you add them all together, beast number 1, beast number 2, beast number 3 has 4 heads. Beast number 4 has 10 horns. If you add all that up, that's 7 heads and 10 horns. Okay? That's just for something later. Now, guess what? This imagery happens again and again throughout the Bible, of man becoming a beast, of man in rebellion against God being a beast, and being like a dragon. Remember David and Goliath? By the way, Daniel has a vision, chapter 2, where this stone that's cut out without hands comes and hits the image, knocks it down, and destroys it, and the stone becomes a mountain, and the mountain of God fills the whole earth. Okay? David and Goliath. Here's David, the little shepherd boy, and he goes after Goliath, and the Bible goes out of its way to tell us in 1 Samuel 17, verse 5, that Goliath was wearing scale armor. Not just armor, but scale armor. When Goliath came out, this enemy of God's people, to meet the champion of the covenant, the champion of the covenant had a smooth stone, and the dragon came out looking like a dragon. Goliath looked like a beast. His armor was scaly. Okay? He was supposed to look like a dragon. Real scary. And David threw the stone and got him in the head and smashed his head. And then he cut it off, like God had promised to Eve. Your seed will crush the head of the dragon. Okay, before we have some other fun stuff with some things, let's go to Revelation 13 and pick up some information here. Just going over what we read at the beginning, we see this beast. Now, I ought to back up and point out that what we read last night, in Revelation 12, verse 3, that there was remember the woman, the mother is giving birth to the man-child that's going to rule all nations with a rod of iron, and the dragon is poised outside of her womb, trying to devour the child, trying to kill it before it was born. We saw how that happened throughout history. That the dragon was always trying to kill the seed before the seed would kill him. The dragon was unable to do that. And the dragon, it says, has 7 heads and 10 horns. Why? As soon as we read that, we're supposed to think, oh yeah, Daniel. If you put all those beasts, all the pagan empires, All the rebel rulers that instead of submitting to God, tried to be God, if you add them all up, they add up to 7 heads and 10 horns. And here we find they are all just little splinter images of the real thing. And what's the real thing? It's the dragon, the enemy of God's people from the very beginning, Satan, the devil, the accuser of the brethren. He's the one that they all are little pictures of. You look at Hitler, that's a little picture of what the dragon is. And here is the real thing. The dragon in all these various manifestations, the 7 heads and 10 horns, has been in various ways trying to destroy that seed before it comes to maturity. And now in Revelation 13 we find another beast. This isn't the dragon because he gets his power and authority from the dragon, but he looks just like him. That's the idea. That here's this beast in the first century rising up in the image of the dragon. Looks just like him. Now, for various reasons, I'll show you a little bit of it, but what I'm saying is that this beast from the sea was the Roman Empire, personified in Nero Caesar. Nero was a bad guy. Let me tell you a little bit about Nero. Nero, for one thing, thought he was a great artist and a musician, and he would hold concerts. No kidding. He'd hold concerts and he would sing, you know. And if you were an important citizen and didn't come to the concert, he'd kill you. So people would come, but he would go on and on for hours. And people would get tired and fall asleep, and he would have them killed. Oh man, what are we going to do? It's another concert. Saturday Night Live, you know. Saturday Night Dead, it could be. And so then people came up with another idea. One guy started it, and it worked for him. He was sitting there listening to Nero. Nero was going on and on for hours, and finally he just went, ooh, grabbed his chest and keeled over and died. It looked like they carried him out. And he got out of the concert that way. Well, Nero began, everybody pretty soon started, oh, my chest, my heart. Okay? So more people started trying this, and so Nero said, anybody who dies in one of my concerts will be buried immediately. But he was a terrible man. He was a wicked man, and he thought he was God. He demanded worship on a scale hitherto undreamed of by any human emperor. He murdered people at will, ordered people to take poison or whatever it would take to get rid of him. He murdered members of his family. He murdered his own wife. His wife, whom he loved very much. I mean, he had a lot of affection for her. Nagged him for coming home late. This is serious. She nagged him for coming home late from the races. True story. She was about 6 or 7 months pregnant, and he threw her down on the ground and then kicked her to death. Well, later, when he realized what he'd done, he was horrified over this, remorseful, and he looked all over to find a replacement for this beautiful wife. And he kept having this picture of her before his mind. He just had a fixation on her. He loved her, and he wanted her back, and he couldn't bring her back to life. And then he found somebody who looked just like his wife. And when he found that person, he had him castrated and turned into his wife. Okay? That's Nero. Nero used to dress up like a beast and put horns on. And he would have prisoners tied up, male and female, and he would go up to them while they were tied up, and he would ravage them, rape them, male and female, and kill them. One thing that was really exciting to him sexually, and I'm not going to go into gross detail, but just he would like to watch torture. And torture really excited him. Some of the worst tortures ever devised. He put one man in a bull, a great big cast iron bull. Had the bull specially designed, put the man inside the bull, tied him up in there, and then lit a fire under it. And people thought, there's no fun in this. We don't get to see the guy die. And then they heard him scream. And the bull was so designed that when he screamed, it sounded like a bull roaring. And they all sat there in the theater and watched that man roast to death and heard his screams. You know the Roman candles that we light up at 4th of July? You know where a Roman candle came from? It was from Nero's practice of taking Christians, tying them up to stakes around his garden at night, covering them with oil and wax, and lighting them. And Nero had his garden parties lit by burning Christians. He persecuted Christians.